Welcome back, everybody, to a special edition of the Long Game podcast with myself, Ben Scallon, and my co-host, Jason Osborne. This is going to be a bit of a shorter episode than we would normally do. We're only going to be taking a couple of viewer questions, and that's because both myself and Jason are going through different turbulence issues at the minute where I am moving house, so I'm temporarily going to have dodgy internet. Jason, you have, I don't know if you want to talk about your situation briefly, just maybe to fill the viewers in on what's going on.
I do. No, I'm just gonna use this as a prayer harvesting machine. No, my wife and I think I mentioned on one of the previous episodes that we were expecting a second child, and that child, thanks be to God, came last week. But unfortunately, she picked up a very severe infection, and so was in the ICU. So work and personal life have been thrown into a bit of turmoil. So rather than leave our viewers high and dry, we're just, unfortunately, it's not going to be the length that we'd like to put out, or probably the most up to date news wise. But I think it's better than nothing, and we do like to make sure you guys have something. So that's why I'm under pressure. It's why Ben is under pressure. So that's why we're doing it this way this week.
Yeah, hopefully, next week, after you've watched this, we will be back to some kind of normal scheduled programming. We might, depending on Jason's situation, have to sub him out with a special guest, somebody like Fatima, perhaps, who you've all been clamoring for since day one.
I will get my position back if she comes on.
We'll see how that goes. But for the time being, we were just going to take a couple of viewer questions as per usual. As I say every week, if you would like to leave a question and have a chance of it being answered on the show, you have to be a Gript subscriber, but you can go to gript.ie/questions, and that link will be on screen for those of you who are viewing. So the first question we have here, I'll take it if you don't mind, was Matt, who says, there's only one election left in Ireland for a while right now. So what is your opinion on the significance of the presidential election later on this year? If, for example, we elect someone more right-leaning, would this have any measurable effect on Irish politics? Well, thank you very much for the question, Matt. What do you think, Jason? Do you think a right-leaning or conservative president would have a significant impact on the political landscape of this country?
There's multiple sides to this question. In terms of national politics, no, I don't think so at all, personally speaking. I think the reason for that being obviously that our president doesn't have any sort of executive power in the same way that the president in the United States does. The more interesting angle, I think, is the way in which they could reposition Ireland on the global stage, because obviously President Higgins, with a lot of his interventions and whatnot, does make global press pretty frequently. I would say he has over the past year. So I think that if you were to have a president singing from a different hymn sheet or taking a different tune, it would be very interesting to see how the international community, to put it that way, would take that. But in terms of national politics, I can't see a conservative president making too much of a difference. I mean, I think it depends. I think it'll be very interesting to see who puts themselves forward for it as well. I think that'll be interesting. And I think once we know the range of candidates and sort of, because obviously, the elephant in the room can't be avoided. You've had some pretty out there candidates suggested over the past while, like McGregor, and while the president's office is a defined thing, who knows what sort of effect someone would. I mean, I don't think he would win. I don't think he'd be anywhere near winning. I think he sort of severely misreads the temperature of the Irish electorate, to put it that way. But I do think that,
I mean, sorry to drop. Like, I think he would have trouble even just getting on the ballot, because what a lot of people don't know is that not anybody can run for president. In order to run for president, you have to have either, I believe it's 4 county councils nominate you,
local authorities,
or 20 members of the Oireachtas. So that could be, 5 senators and 15 TDs or some combination like that. So given his recent controversies and scandals, I would think it would be very difficult for him to meet that threshold to even get on the ballot in the first place, let alone win or come close to winning. So that's a
No,
factor that a lot of people don't consider.
you're exactly right. And sort of speaking in a hypothetical sense in terms of a sort of out there candidate who might come forward. But as a result, I do find it very hard to imagine anyone who could put themselves forward who would sort of upset the apple cart in the way that maybe Matt is supposing with this question. But I do think it'll be interesting regardless. I mean, I think, as I say, that President Higgins has sort of, I wouldn't say expanded the role, but he really has sort of pushed the envelope in terms of his international interventions and things over the years. So whoever does come next, I think that they'll probably there is the opportunity for them to take a little bit more liberty in terms of their pronouncements. Whether they follow in his footsteps, and that obviously remains to be seen, but a precedent has certainly been set.
Yeah, I think as well, one underutilized power of the president, and I'm not an expert on the constitutional law and these sorts of areas, but of course, the president can refer legislation to the Supreme Court to get it challenged or checked basically by the Supreme Court judges to make sure that it's constitutional before he signs it. Now, if they rule that it is constitutional, then he has to sign it or she has to sign it, regardless of their personal opinion. That's kind of not within their power. But the point of that is then, if you had something like, for example, the COVID lockdown, if we had a good president who was questioning the constitutionality of those measures, he could have referred that to the Supreme Court. You wouldn't have situations like we saw where you had ordinary citizens having to try and scrape together hundreds of thousands of euros in crowd-funded money, people chipping in 50 quid, 10 quid of their own money to try and get some kind of Supreme Court challenge. The president could just do it automatically. That would be huge. I've also heard, and I don't know about this, the exact practicalities of it, if you would get away with it, but Peter Casey, the businessman from Derry, who ran last time and came second in the presidential race, he was saying that one thing he thinks the president should be doing more is he has the power to pardon anyone he wants. We have a presidential pardon, but it's almost never been used. It's usually used posthumously, like if somebody was wrongfully convicted for something or there's controversy around their conviction from decades or a century ago, then the president will come in and say, oh, well, we pardoned this person after their death. What Casey was saying, and again, I don't know the practicalities of whether this would work, but he said that he would nullify things like the hate speech bill if it was to come in and people were to be charged under it. He'd just say, well, you're pardoned and you're grafted, basically, and just kill that whole law dead, which would be interesting if we had a president who was operating like that. I don't know how the rest of the state would handle such a maneuver. So it'd be interesting, I think.
It would be, but it does, as you say, that may be there on paper, but so much of the Irish presidency is governed, for want of a better way of putting it, by convention. It's the way the president does things. This was why there's been so much uproar over the course of President Higgins' term, because in terms of all of his pronouncements, people sort of saw him as dictating foreign policy, which obviously isn't his. Well, that's the government's role, first of all, but it's also not the convention around these things. So I do think that you would need a very strong character, a real firebrand. And as we've seen, even in the US, where the president is a much more powerful figure, it's one thing to have these grand plans. It's another thing to enact them once you get into office. And I can imagine that the pressure would be much more stifling in Ireland with that weight of convention on the side. Again, I don't know what Mr. Casey would do were he to get into office, but I do think there's a premium put on convention in Ireland that there isn't, say, in the States, for example, or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, the president here is supposed to be above politics, as we know. He's not allowed to contradict government policy officially. So that doesn't mean somebody like Higgins doesn't spout off about things every day of the week, but it does mean that he's ostensibly not supposed to, particularly when it goes against the official. I think as well, you could really set the agenda in terms of raising issues. Like, imagine if the
Mm,
president was to do a national address and just talk about, I'm just going to pick a random issue off the top of my head, say the hundreds of children who have gone missing from Tusla Care. And it was just
yeah.
to talk about that. That's not contradicting government policy in any way. That's not in breach of his office, but it would be a megaphone that would suddenly bring that to the attention of the vast majority of people and kind of put it on the agenda. It would make it a big deal. It's, the president is talking about X, Y, and Z.
Now,
So I think culturally you could do a lot with that.
you could. My only thinking is that isn't it the case? Again, obviously we're journalists, neither of us are lawyers. My understanding is that um, in terms of addresses and things like this, even the president often has these, not often, it is the case that these are run by government to ensure that he's not contradicting government positions, government policy, things like this. So I would find it difficult to say that if a president who say was very critical of the way immigration is being handled, and like you could do this in quite a nuanced way. You wouldn't even have to be contradicting government policy, but you could be giving a statement sort of encouraging the real enforcement of government policy or something like this. I find it near impossible to imagine that would get clearance to go to air. Um, so I just there's a whole load of the Irish president in some ways, while on paper there's even though it is a ceremonial, largely ceremonial position, there is more room to maneuver on paper, I suppose. But it's a real sort of straitjacketed position. It would be hard to imagine even someone with the inclination for these things speaking out. But as you say, like one episode with President Higgins that I always remember, an example of a president putting their interests out there, to put it that way, although this was in line with, say, government interests, which is why probably no one pulled him up on it in Leinster House or anything like this, was when, I don't know if you remember back in 2022, when there was a massacre of Christians in Nigeria. It was like 40 Christians were massacred. And to be fair, this one made global news. There was a lot of talk about it. And President Higgins, in his statement about it, essentially managed to shoehorn climate change and sort of the fallout of climate change as making the world more violent, and in a sort of very slight way suggesting that you're going to see more violence like this as a result of climate change. It was so egregious that the bishop of the diocese in question issued a statement in response. Of all of the people speaking about this, the bishop of this, I think it was Ondo diocese in Nigeria, came out and said, like, will you cool it with the climate change talk? We had a group of people slaughtered by militants here. It has nothing to do with climate change. And something like that, number one, it made us look very stupid on a world stage if we're concerned about things like that. But it is an example of the way in which a president can put something out there that people are going to hear and take note of. And clearly Higgins is very concerned about this. So there are ways to do it. It's just, I think, someone who maybe is a little spicier than the government might have difficulty doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. But it would certainly you'd enjoy the sea change and the conniption fit meltdown that they would have if you had somebody coming out like an inverse of Higgins doing the things he does, but for more traditionalist or conservative worldview. Given that he's set the precedent, we've had 14 years of this guy now acting in this way with the tacit approval or explicit approval in many cases of official Ireland. So I'd love to see them try and argue against his the anti-Higgins, whoever that happens to be. Senator Sharon Keoghan becomes president, let's say. God help them. So the presidential address will just be her reading another 200 genders in front of the Ars on Neutron. So with that said, would you like to take the other question there?
I would. So this one is from an anonymous. I was going to say an anonymous source. It's not very journalistic. It's just some writing into us. Can you explain more about the consequences of Ireland removing its triple lock? They write, should two be? So I assume that should that be put to referendum first? What's Ireland's history with military conscription drafting? Will removing the triple lock remove our neutrality and expose our men to conscription? So a good bit there. If you'd like to jump into the deep end with that one, Ben.
Yeah, I think I want to be nuanced about this. I'll first out lay my cards on the table and say I'm absolutely opposed to removing the triple lock. I think it's a bad idea. I strongly support Irish military neutrality, and I think that it would damage that. But I'll give the pro triple lock removal case first, just
Well,
to be balanced
maybe
about it.
maybe we could make this a bit more adversarial because yeah, I do also think it's a nuanced one, and like yourself, I would also be pro Irish neutrality. But I wouldn't be of the opinion, I know this is unpopular in certain circles, that removing the triple lock is a blow to our neutrality. I think all it does is put the issue entirely in Irish hands, and then the question has to be raised: what are those Irish hands going to do? So I suppose I would ask you, how do you see this as being contrary to that?
Actually, at this point, we should probably explain what the triple lock is, just for the benefit of some people who might be watching at home who aren't familiar or who don't understand its full implications. Would you like to maybe explain, Jason, what the triple lock means and why this is in the news currently and being discussed?
For sure. So the triple lock, just to put it simply, is essentially a rule we have so that if we want to send more than 12 members of the defense forces overseas on a peacekeeping mission, we have to have the approval of the UN Security Council, the cabinet, and the Dáil. When it's put to vote, a majority have to assent to it, and that would ensure that we can go ahead with a peacekeeping mission. The reason it's in the news at the moment, and I presume the reason we're being asked about it currently, is because that's due to be amended. They're looking to amend it, I should say, with some legislation that would see the need for clearance from the UN Security Council removed. The reason now that they want to do this is because the argument is that our ability to send peacekeepers abroad is essentially, there's a veto given to the members of the UN Security Council. Whether you agree or disagree, I believe government members have previously voiced concerns that members of the UN Security Council, permanent members like Russia or China, or indeed the United States, the UK, France, they're the permanent members of the Security Council. They would have a veto over our ability to send troops overseas. So that's why government members, as I say, want to see that particular lock, to put it that way, removed. And then they would only need cabinet approval and Dáil approval. So that's why it's in the news. That's what it is in a nutshell. So back to, I suppose, making the pro and against arguments for it.
Yeah, so the reason I would oppose getting rid of the triple lock is because I think it infringes or diminishes Irish neutrality, in the sense that all of the countries on the Security Council having to approve a mission means that we are not going to step on anybody's toes or regional interests by engaging in our peacekeeping. So if for some reason, let's say there's a conflict happening in Lesotho or whatever, and Ireland says, hey, can we send peacekeepers in there? And everybody agrees except for China. Again, this is a hypothetical. I'm just picking a random example. They say, no, we don't want you to put peacekeepers in there. Then that's not, by doing so, by saying, well, we're doing it anyway, we're antagonizing a major world power, which is counterproductive, I think, for a small country that's trying to position itself as neutral on the world stage. So the whole purpose of the triple lock is to say, when everyone agrees, when all the major world powers can come to a unanimous consensus and say, yes, there's instability in this particular region and it would be good for somebody to come in and maintain the peace, that's where Ireland comes in. And otherwise, if there's any controversy about it, if anybody's not happy about it, then we're not going to get involved because we don't want to step on anybody's toes. I think that's a good policy, personally.
Yeah, you see, I would disagree with that one, in that I would be of the opinion that this essentially puts our, I would say, ability to act as we see best into the hands of the international community. I don't think anyone here, I mean, we're talking about peacekeeping missions here ultimately. So we're not talking about Ireland rolling into any country in a shock and awe style assault or anything like that. Not that we'd even be capable of it, but we're not talking about this kind of thing. And I feel that,
the only shock and awe would be the state of our equipment. Your jaw hit the floor when they just see just disrepair of our armed forces.
They see 4 propeller planes fly over and they'd be like, they're like, what the hell is this? And I don't know. I think that'd be enough to incapacitate them for at least a day so we can make some inroads. But I think that sort of, I do think that having it entirely in the hands of the government, again, the nature of the government is very much up for debate, and whether they have the best ability to govern us and guide us in the present world, that's very much up for debate. But I think in theory, having it entirely in Irish hands is a lot more in line with sort of, my understanding of pursuing Ireland's interests. Because I don't, yeah, to keep with the hypothetical examples, say there's some country that from our perspective is clearly being wronged or whatever, but it's against the interests of one of its bigger neighbors over there. I mean, do we want to back off just because, we might be stepping on their toes, even though we think that it's, and again, this isn't putting it into the EU's hands, this isn't putting it into anyone else's hands. This is a matter of like, it would only need approval from the cabinet and from the Dáil, once it's put to vote. And so I just think that as it stands at the moment, I know I'm making a bit of a messy case for it here, but as it stands at the moment, the only thing preventing us is, say, all of the regional interests of all of the powers around the world that are on the UN Security Council. I don't particularly care about their interests. I care about, if we, and obviously the judgment of the current government aside, we're speaking in theory here, I think that if we think that it would be good and moral to intervene in a particular situation, and again, it's not even an assault we're talking about here, we're talking about peacekeeping, which is in and of itself fairly morally inoffensive, and indeed you might say morally good. I think we should have the power to do that. And I think, people who might be inclined to disagree to a peacekeeping mission, obviously I'm not naive. I know they would have worries about, interference through our peacekeepers and through our mission and all of this from other powers. But I think it's for us to decide rather than for any of them to veto what we want to do.
Don't you think that poses an issue for neutrality, though? Because, of course, peacekeeping is a good thing. I think that Ireland should be very proud of its record on peacekeeping, and long may it continue. But with that said, it does necessarily entail getting involved in conflicts that have nothing to do with us. If a lot of people in the Congo or in Lebanon or wherever else are fighting each other over some dispute in that country, that could not conceivably have less to do with us and our interests. So by inserting ourselves into a situation where major world powers might have explicitly told us, no, we don't want you there for whatever reason, they have their own interests and reasons for doing that, are we not risking our neutrality through that? I think you could make a moral case. You could say, well, screw you, Russia. We don't care what you want. But still, from a military neutrality perspective, I feel like that's a recipe for trouble.
Well, I think the only difference here, say, is if we're going to allow other countries a veto over it. I mean, we have the same inclination either way. So if we're putting our suggestion to the UN Security Council and then they say, no, some member of the Security Council says, no, you can't do that. It's not like we didn't have that inclination anyway. So, you couldn't necessarily call us neutral. All that we're doing is allowing someone else to tell us that we can't do it. Again, I think it's very much a matter for our judgment. I'm not saying, necessarily, I don't even think we should be going into a very hot situation or a hot war or something like this. I think it's the nature of peacekeeping that you go in once things have calmed down and then you sort of stand there in the middle, like, steady on, lads, on both sides, and ideally enforce that. But I think that the only difference between, say, the present situation and if we had full control over it is that, we're essentially allowing our instincts to be vetoed by other powers, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have that power over it.
This is a slight tangent, but a job that I would love for myself and for Ireland as a nation, if I was to ever be in a position of authority where I could make something like this happen, would be to be like a war referee or a war umpire, by which I mean I genuinely, honestly, I'm completely neutral on most foreign conflicts, be it like Israel and Palestine. Like I don't get involved in these things. I don't have strong. It's not that I don't have strong feelings. Like on a human level, obviously you hate to see human suffering. I'm a Christian. I believe that all people have inherent dignity and worth, and it's a tragedy. But as for the politics, it's not. That's between you guys, and I stay out of that. So, given that I don't particularly have a dog in any of these fights, you often hear controversy and propaganda on both sides where something blows up on the border between Ukraine and Russia, let's say, like a power station blows up, and you have one side saying, oh, it was them, they fired artillery and they tried to attack our thing and it was sabotage, and the other side are blaming them, saying, no, they blew it up themselves, it was a false flag or whatever, and it's like unclear and in the fog of war. I'd love to be a war referee where I go in with a team of experts who I've handpicked and I go, look, I don't particularly care. I'm just saying the evidence shows they did it. Like, do with that information what you will. But that's
and then
I'm just telling it as I say it.
You head back to Ireland for dinner then.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm not involved here. I'm just telling you this is what I've observed, and that's what the evidence seems like to me. So I think that would be. I'd love if we had some kind of neutral guy with a whistle in the middle who's just calling exactly as he sees it, but no.
They have to obey your decree, such that once you leave, they get like, I don't know, a 10-day head start in terms of attacking their enemy, where they can attack back. I think that that kind of answers just the only point that I would say. They were asking whether it would removing the triple lock would remove our neutrality and expose Irishmen to conscription. You know, again, whether it removes our neutrality or not, as you'll just have seen, is a matter for debate. I'm of the opinion that it doesn't, whereas Ben and a lot of other people would be of the opinion that it is a blow to neutrality. But I think we can both agree on the fact that it doesn't open up immediately Irishmen to subscribe to. Sorry, not subscription. Do subscribe to Gript, but it doesn't open Irishmen up immediately to conscription or anything like this. I mean, there's a whole load of other hoops that have to be jumped through for something like that to come about.
And I will also say, again, because I don't want to be hyperbolic and I always want to be like reasonable about these things that we discuss, there is a good argument, as Jason had just outlined, from a sovereignty perspective, saying we should control our own military and foreign globalist entities like the UN should have no input whatsoever over where Irish troops go. You could make that argument. It's not an argument I subscribe to, but I understand it, and I don't think it's outrageous to think that way.
Yeah,
but,
it grates my gears that you could have some little bitch on the UN Security Council who just takes a personal dislike to Ireland, and every time Ireland's like, hey, let's do this, genuinely noble thing, and they're like, not on my watch.
Yeah, like the fact that Britain controls where Irish troops go does have kind of there's something there that just it creates bad vibes. I don't know what it is. With that said, we might move on to another question here from Joseph, who says, now that woke is dead, or at least the head of the stake is dead, how long will it be before Ireland catches up? Woke comes from the US and Trump is killing it, at least in any federal agency or place receiving federal funds. Will Ireland be a holdout like the last standing woke island, or will we be brought to heel? I like that imagery that, those Japanese holdout guys who are still on, they were standing guard for World War II 35 years after the war had ended, just because nobody remembered to tell them, which has got to be, I'd love to know the reaction of those guys when they found out. And because apparently, this is a total tangent that has nothing to do with the question asked, and we will get to the question in a minute, but just on those Japanese guys who were standing guard, I heard that initially when people told them, the war is over and has been for decades, right? Like, you're wasting your lives. They assumed this was Allied tricks, that this was like American agents who were trying to trick them into abandoning their posts, and they didn't believe it. And they had to be talked into the fact that, you have just been totally wasting your life for decades. So pretty tragic.
A very human reaction. I mean, I feel like there's so many global situations today that, if the enemy came to you and said, hey, you guys know you can come out of the bushes, you guys are like lost 30 years ago, to be like, misinformation, disinformation, be like, no way, Jose. And I would be disappointed if their reaction was anything other than seppuku upon finding out, after being such valiant soldiers for 30 years, fighting no one but their own minds in those jungles.
Running out of shaving cream, your beard is down to your feet, so Yeah, no, it's grim stuff. But on the actual question, with that said, will Ireland be the Japanese holdout soldiers clinging to our woke lunacy long after the rest of the world has moved on? Do you think that'll happen? Or are we going to
You
cop on
know,
ourselves in the near future?
I'm inclined to say no. And you asked me on another day, I might have a different answer to this question, but at the moment, I'm inclined to say no because I look at some of the other countries that seem to be doing way more insane things to me than we are. I mean, obviously, I think sort of our immigration situation is totally out of hand and everything, and so you could say that as long as that's going on, we're woke island. But I think we have to be kind of precise with our definitions here. I think in terms of a lot of the zealotry for things that we've seen over the past decade, like continuous social reform and whatnot, I actually think a lot of that has lost steam in Ireland. Now, some might say that's because they got everything they wanted and they're in all the positions of power. Now they're able to work quietly in the background. And there's some truth to that. I think that a lot of our important institutions are overwhelmingly progressive still, and I think they will be for some time. But I think obviously politics is a very important determinant of the way in which this is going to go. And I think because of the international climate, as outlined in the question by Joseph, I think that our politicians are going to have to tone it down pretty immensely, and not only that, but be seen to be toning it down. I mean, like an example of this, I think, is it was just in the news a day or two ago, me or even today possibly, Micheál Martin saying that absolutely he'd invite Trump over after St. Patrick's Day. It's like, I don't know, 5 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, he would not have been. I'm strongly inclined to say he wouldn't have been so quick to give that in such positive terms. So I do think that there is, as everyone knows, there's a bit of a cultural war going on in Ireland at the moment, and contrary to what's popularly voiced, it's not an import from America. It's completely homegrown cultural war in some sense. But I do I do think that our institutions are going to be a bit slower to turn around. But I do think, as people always accuse them of, I do think our politicians just sort of go with the way the wind is blowing. And for the past couple of years, it's been a very progressive wind. That wind is changing big time. And so I think they have to adjust themselves to that. I would be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think if Trump does come to visit, I'd love to hear him say the words, "Who's the gowl now?" as he goes to shake the hand of any one of our senior cabinet members. But I would, what I would pay to hear him bring that up is that it actually hit his radar. But regardless, yeah, I mean, this like a lot of people complain that we bring up something like transgenderism so much and say, "Oh, would you ever shut up about it? It's not a big deal." First of all, it is a big deal. It's a massive issue that affects many, many people, including children, and it's entrenched deeply in, our institutions. But second of all, while I agree that it's not the most important issue, I think it's kind of what ecologists call a biological indicator, where you take something like a butterfly or a frog that is not necessarily the most important creature in the entire ecosystem, but it is the most sensitive creature. And when the butterflies or the frogs start dying, then you can assume, oh, something's coming down the track. That's like the canary in the coal mine, that there's something in the environment that's toxic or poisonous that's going to kill everything else. And so I think similarly, the transgender issue, while it might not be the most important issue in the world, if your society can't even get that right, if we don't even know how many genders there are, that's an indicator of how rotten things really are. So with that in mind, as far as using it as an indicator of where we are as a society, just there the other day, out of curiosity, on Oireachtas debates, I looked up the word transgender as far as Dáil and Shannon contributions. It hasn't been mentioned in either houses of the Oireachtas since last October. Not even once. It hasn't come up. And I'm for the last couple of days, I've been going around Dublin and I've been taking photos and videos of various things that, just for stock B-roll. And I was trying to get pride flags. I couldn't find it. There aren't that many. Obviously there's like that little crosswalk on Georgia Street outside the George that has the rainbow colors, but that stuff is not nearly as in your face as it was even 1 year ago. And I think it really looks like it's on the decline, and we're approaching the phase at which, and I've said this on the show before, I think people are starting to become embarrassed by it. I think it's really getting to the stage where it's cringe, and they know it's cringe, and it's I know from talking to TDs and politicians that it comes up on the doors, things like the hate speech bill, things like all of this rogue stuff that people don't like it and have rejected it. And so it might not be as flamboyant as we're seeing in other countries, where countries like America are very vocally declaring, we are abandoning this stuff. It's a load of crap. We're doing away with it. I don't know if we'll be as explicit as that. I think we might just quietly retcon it. And in 5 years' time, if you ask me, all Martin, hey, what about the gender recognition bill? He'll kind of go, the what? I've never heard of it. What's it?
Who's
what
that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, who wants to know? I think so. I do think it's on the way out, but I think it'll be more of a kind of a slow sweeping it under the carpet, and it like that picture of Stalin and your man who just gets removed. It'll be like that. It's just airbrushed from the picture, and we'll all act like it never happened.
Like the Pride exhibition in Collins Barracks will just quietly disappear from be replaced with, I don't know, some further nationalistic exhibition. But I do also think that there's so many elements to this, which is why it's impossible to cover in a brief response. But it's also the case that I think material conditions are much harder now than they were even a decade ago. I do think that there was a certain degree of comfortability was required to engage with such sort of frivolous issues for so long. And we're at a stage now where the housing crisis is really reaching a peak. That's being exacerbated by the immigration situation, being exacerbated by the threat that multinationals are going to pull out and all of these different things. I think that naturally when sort of, how would you put it, much more important economic and social and material considerations come onto the table, that stuff was always going to take a back seat. That's why people used to say, my dumb sort of group of friends, myself included, would be saying, if World War III came along, you'd be pretty sure that a lot of this stuff will go out the window. And it's like, that was true. So I think that's kind of part of what you're seeing now. So suffice to say, it's a mixed picture, but I think a good metric is as long as people are having a tough time and politicians are hearing that at the door, you're going to be hearing way less about what you might call traditionally woke stuff. But it doesn't mean it's going anywhere. As I say, I think a lot of this is ingrained in the minds of people working in various institutions in Ireland, and that's obviously one to watch. But I do think that obviously the most important area for this is the political, and I do think the winds of change are blowing pretty strongly there.
Like, you think about some of the people who have been appointed in the recent government, the fact that Verona Murphy, who is not like deeply conservative or anything, but she was in Fine Gael and she got deselected as a candidate in Wexford because she made some very common sense statements about immigration in 2019 or 2018. I can't remember which, but regardless, she basically said, we should vet people who are coming in, who are asylum seekers from the Middle East, because we don't know if they've been radicalized by ISIS. They could be ISIS agents posing as refugees. Totally reasonable concern that has been proven to be a legitimate concern in other countries around that time. There were people who were committing terrorist attacks who would come in as refugees who were ISIS agents. So a real threat. And for saying that in 2019, she was dropped from Fine Gael and they said, we want nothing to do with her. And they totally disowned her. She then ran one as an independent. Now she has come back into the fold of the government so strongly that they made it to Count Corla, which is one of the most senior positions within the Oireachtas that you could have.
If I remember correctly, it's the most highly paid position as well, if I remember correctly.
It is indeed. She was there telling the Taoiseach today in the chamber, because he was talking over somebody. He said, "You're acting like a child." Like, name a cabinet minister who can tell the Taoiseach, "Shut up, you're acting like a child." She's got the mammy energy to control the room. So that kind of tells you and then I also think, in addition to that, to reinforce the points, the last count, Corla, is Fianna Fáil TD John McGuinness, who is one of the more conservative people within the Fianna Fáil backbench. Like this guy, he's pro-life. He is always going on about state waste and the need for an overhaul of government efficiency. He was on the Public Accounts Committee, and he's been ranting about that for years as a critical issue. Like, he'd be probably in a similar way of thinking on a lot of issues. He talks about how NGOs need to be audited and examined, because he's sure that there's all kinds of financial scandals there with the amount of money they receive from the state. So these are the kinds of people who are getting positions within the government. I think that tells you a lot about the trajectory. Is it the government that I would pick if I was High King of Ireland and I could choose my ideal cabinet? Probably not, and I'm sure many people watching this feel the same way. But as far as what we've had, and in the scheme of things, you have to work with what you've got, and I think it could be a lot worse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, I think, as we said in one of our earliest episodes, I think the next election will be extraordinarily interesting, because a lot of those concrete difficulties people are facing clearly aren't going away. I mean, and I think they're only going to be exacerbated by the fact that Ireland is well on course to fall well short of its climate targets in terms of cutting carbon emissions and things, which means that we'll be incurring a massive fine as a result of that. So there's all sorts of changes. And if the government wants to avoid that fine, they have to make all sorts of changes. They're going to be very biting. They really are going to nip at everyone's heels. And I think that as a result, I can't imagine we're going to be in any easier, I don't know, be a doom monger or anything like this, but I can't imagine we're going to be in any easier position come the next general election. So I think I can't imagine the direction of travel is going to turn back in favor of the frivolous anytime soon, to put it that way.
Absolutely. And with that, unfortunately, I think we'll have to leave our wonderful viewers for this week. As I say, I know this is a little bit shorter than you were used to, and it's not the most topical, but as we explained at the start, we both have our respective issues going on at the minute. So hopefully we'll be back to more regular programming. If you would like to leave a question in the interim for next week, you can go to gript.ie/questions to leave a question, and we would be delighted to hear from any of our subscribers. Freeloaders get nothing, as per usual. But with that said,
unlike in the state.
very much, very, very different. We operate a private sector mindset over here, a grind set. So with that said, we look forward to seeing you all next week, and God bless.
God bless.